Hi, Misha here, and I already posted a little bit of a demo video of what I was going to be getting into shortly. This is the so-called Century series of American jet aircraft from the 50s, and trying something new here. Picked up a it's actually looking for like a model display that rotates, but kind of ran across a cake thing, so thought it'd work. Seems to work pretty well. It's a little slippery, so probably will add like some texture or coating to it, but figure this way I can more easily rotate stuff for you all. We'll see how it works out. Well, starting off the Century series, obviously we have to start with the first one, the North American F-100 Supersabre. And this really dates back to 1951. At that time, the F-86 had been in combat in Korea pretty extensively, and North America kind of looked at what worked and what didn't from it, and they kind of set about redesigning it, making an updated version. And the big thing was they wanted to make a supersonic fighter. The U.S. Air Force took a look at the plans. They, generally speaking, liked them. They kind of wrote back a few notes on the drawings saying change this, this, and this. North American did. And in 1952, the Air Force basically ordered the program to go ahead. 1953, the first test flight, and then the first production models rolled off late that year, and the Air Force received its first Super Sabres in September, so kind of towards the end of 1954. So this plane missed the Korean War, but it pretty much was a direct result of the Korean War. It is about 50 foot long, has a wingspan of a little under 39 feet. It is supersonic. It's capable of reaching Mach 1.3, or about 750 miles per hour. It had a maximum ceiling of about 50,000 feet, so not a whole lot better than the F-86, but didn't really need to be. Unfortunately, pretty much right as the F-100A, the first version, went into service, they started to notice problems. It had major issues with yaw and just general control. It was just it had some issues. It had some benefits, obviously. It was still a good airplane in the broad sense. At least it was an advanced airplane for its day and time. But actually, a few people were killed, including some test pilots. So these were grounded at the end of 1954. Kind of a crash course in revisions was conducted, and then they were put back into service in February of 55. But honestly, the problems never really went away. It was a reasonably high-performance plane, but it was, a first-generation supersonic fighter, and a lot of those from different nations had issues. They would introduce the F-100C. It's kind of a tactical bomber version capable of carrying a nuclear weapon. Then they would introduce in 1956 this model here, the F-100D, which was made for close support ground attack. But of course it was still capable of being a fighter. But it was kind of a little bit of a specialized ground attack, conventional warfare version. Pilots nicknamed this the Hun for 100, being the Century Series. And they would produce these from 1953 till 1959, and they would build just under 2,300. So not a small production run. However, the Air Force really was never happy with this plane, and newer, better things were already coming onto the horizon. So as early as 1958, they started pulling some F-100s out of service, and they were really hoping to just kind of have them all pulled out, and they actually even officially started to retire them in 1961. But then the Cold War heated up with things like the Bay of Pigs and the Berlin Wall crisis. And so they were essentially pulled back from the brink of being retired in 1961-62. Some were sent over to Germany, and then some were deployed in East Asia as defense fighters in places like Thailand. But of course they would end up operating in Vietnam very soon. In fact, they would start flying sorties over there very early on, and the first F-100 was shot down over Vietnam in 1964. And the F-100 has the distinction of the first jet-on-jet air-to-air combat and kill with a batch of MiG-17s in 1965. And at least 3 MiG-17s were shot down during that engagement. But the F-100 definitely did not get through the war unscathed. Over 240 were shot down or otherwise lost during that war. And they saw pretty heavy use up through about 1969. Early on, they were used as wild weasels. They were also used as fighter bombers, and of course just support and escort fighters. But by the late 60s, they were starting to be replaced first by the F-105 Thunder Chief, and then later the F-4 Phantom. The last F-100s were pulled out of Vietnam in 1971. And I should mention, by this point, most F-100s were being operated by the Air National Guard, which was deployed in Vietnam, not the Air Force proper. The Air Force had already kind of gone away from them and retired them or given them to the Air Guard or put them in reserve. The Air Guard themselves would keep flying the F-100 through the 70s, retiring the last ones in 78 and 79. Remember, by this point, they had been out of production for 20 years. Parts were getting harder to find, maintenance, yada yada. And they never really completely addressed that yaw issue. Pilots just kind of learned workarounds. These were armed with 4 20mm cannons with 200 rounds each. That's another lesson they learned from Korea, that F-86 had 6 50 cal machine guns, although some very late production F-86s may have been fitted with some 20mm cannon. It also was an early user of guided missiles. It was given the Sidewinder in 1958. As I said, it could carry a nuclear weapon. It could also carry rockets and other just bombs, especially the D model here. And that's the F-100 in kind of a nutshell. Just a brief overview. Was it a decent plane? Yes. Was it a good plane? Maybe. Was it a great plane? No. It was a first generation. Gotta remember, the F-86 was at the very least a second generation jet, possibly third if you want to call it that in America. And this was the first generation of the supersonics. And just, they were using a lot newer electronics, weaponry. So they were kind of experimenting here. But it would soon be eclipsed by new, better things. As far as this Hobbymaster model, it's exactly what you'd expect. If you've watched any of my other videos, you know these are diecast 1/72 scale, so they're mostly made of metal. They have removable ordnance. They have opening, closing cockpit. This one, some of them, the cockpit, you have two, an opened one and a closed one you can peg in. This is one of the ones that actually has a hinge on the cockpit, so you can hinge it open or closed. It comes with quite a few ordnance. It has missiles, bombs. I did find the ordnance kind of weird to peg in. I'm not sure what is the issue. I've had some Hobbymasters where they fit loose. I've had some where they fit tight. This one wasn't really either. They just didn't fit quite right. So I'm not sure what's up. I kind of have them just ad hoc on there right now, but I'll do a more permanent solution later. So, like the plane, the ordnance could use some work, but this is an older Hobbymaster. Newer Hobbymasters from the last year or so seem like they've really improved a lot to do with the accessories. But the plane itself is very solid. I like the hinge canopy. I like the front nose intake, the engine intake there. I think that's neat. So a cool plane. This was actually the last one I picked up in the Century series. Gotta admit, it kind of interested me less than a lot of the others. I like the F-86. Again, this was an interim step, and therefore really was just, I don't want to say it was a forgotten plane. A lot of flyers remember the Hun fondly, so I don't want to dismiss their memories, but you know, to the general public like myself, it's not really something people think of as iconic American jet fighters. But it did serve in Vietnam. In fact, it had the distinction of being in theater the longest of any aircraft model, because it was there so early, and it lasted till 1971, so it was there a long time. And it definitely did its job. These were used as bombers on occasion, like I said, escort fighters, or just dog fighters. It was a multi-role airplane, although they didn't really use that terminology in the 50s and 60s. But it really was. I mean, especially if you count like the A, C, and D models. There's also an F model, which was a two-seater, by the way. Well, folks, if you have any questions or comments, I welcome them below. If you could, like, share, and subscribe. And as always, please check out my other videos, and also check out the description for a coupon code over at Pete's Collectibles if you'd like to save a few bucks and are interested in any models for yourself. This one actually did not come from Pete's because the F-100 has been out of production for a bit from Hobbymaster, so I actually had to find this elsewhere, just kind of online auction type thing. But you do what you must. The price is fair. It's actually one of the signature editions, too. Sometimes Hobbymaster does those. Well, really appreciate you tuning in. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.